episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are starting a new book, new author from our Friends Pitching Fantasy series. This was one of the books I pitched to you, the book that you selected, and it is none other than The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman.
Yep, I could not resist the chance to read about another rogue character, another thief. Everyone knows I'm a huge fan of The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, Among Thieves by M.J. Kuhn, and many more awesome rogue-like protagonists. And we've got another awesome one here in Kinch from The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. I'm super excited to get into this one with you, Charles, and I'm really satisfied with my choice from your Friends Pitching Fantasy books. I mean, pitched 3 great ones, but I have no regrets.
You know, I'm really excited to get into this too, Dylan. It's funny, I had picked 2 what I would have considered palate cleanser books for us, and then this one, which was like perfectly to form for us. We get it recommended to us all the time. People are like, guys, if you're talking about these books, you have to read The Blacktongue Thief. And I'm looking at the back of this book, and I couldn't think of a better assembly of authors to get my interest than the authors that I'm seeing in the like blurb section of the jacket of this book. I mean, we're seeing, for fans of Joe Abercrombie and Nicholas Eames, I'm seeing Glenn Cook, Brent Weeks. I'm seeing Robin Hobb. The author credits George R. R. Martin, Tolkien, Patrick Rothfuss, and Abercrombie as the only 4 authors he mentions and thanks in his afterword. So it's like, oh my goodness, this is like the perfect mix for us, it seems. And I'm surprised it's taken us this long to read it. But here we are. I was very excited to get into it, and now I'm very eager to talk about it.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to talk at all, you and I, about this book. I wasn't even sure.
Saving it.
I know, it's always nice when we when we really go in blind here, and I'm pumped. I mean, like you said, Charles, he's name dropping folks like Joe Abercrombie and Pat Rolfes, who we're gigantic fans of. Obviously, we've had Joe on the show to talk to. He's this also gets compared all the time to, I think you mentioned it, Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames, which is another book that finds that really interesting middle ground between like a fantasy story that has takes itself seriously in terms of the story and its stakes. It's not just like, joke after joke after joke. It's a real story you're supposed to care about the drama of, but like doesn't take itself too seriously, whereas like you're not supposed to be laughing and having a good time throughout.
Right.
So it's a really interesting place. It's kind of interesting if it's something you would call a grimdark novel or not. That might be an interesting topic to dive into at some point. But it certainly has some of those elements that makes you understand where the Joe Abercrombie inspiration comes from. And obviously, such an incredible book and really on the cutting edge here. And it was published in 2021. So, I mean, now it is 2023, which is kind of hard to believe, but still quite recent.
I know we're still fresh into 2023, but it does feel like it's been a while since this book has been out, only because of how much we have seen it in the conversation. And yeah, I'm super excited to get into it. I guess we should just start talking about this book. Let's not delay any longer. But first, we need to do one of your famous spoiler warnings.
Yeah, this one's pretty straightforward because it's the first book in this world by Christopher Buehlman. If you haven't yet read The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman, then now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones if you don't want to have anything spoiled for you, because we're going to have a no holds barred conversation about this novel.
Well said, Dylan. So let's go ahead and get into this book, The Blacktongue Thief. I think it's time for some carkery and shite jokes now. What do you say?
Can we say shite?
I think so.
As long as we don't hit that hard sound on our family friendly show, we can say shite. So, I mean, yeah, it's time for some shite talk, but this book was anything but shite. It was
Well said.
an awesome novel. And you know what was also anything but shite? Christopher Buehlman doing the narration
Oh, yes.
of his own book for the audiobook. So Charles, I think both you and I switched back and forth between reading the physical and the audio. I already had a copy of the physical book, but I had people up in our Twitter mentions saying like, "Hey, this is the best narration of the year that it was published." And I was like, "Oh, that's awesome. You know, we love audiobooks. I'll have to check that out." And to my surprise, when I looked at who the narrator was, you might have thought it was a mistake that they accidentally put the author, but it was no mistake. Christopher Buehlman himself does the narration for this story. And Charles, it is incredible. And like,
Yeah.
what are the chances that a guy has such a gift for both writing and narrating the audiobook? Because I know like, whenever I see it's like, oh, the author's reading his own book or their own book, I am like, a little hesitant. I'm a little concerned because what are the chances they have both of those skill sets? But Buehlman knocked it out of the park.
Right. And that surprised me. You know, I was doing some research on Christopher Buehlman, and it's like, oh, he's an author, comedian, screenwriter. He's experienced in the theater. He writes horror books. And this is his first fantasy book. So it's like, okay, this guy, can he really do it all? And then I'm listening to the audiobook, and, 10 seconds in, it's like written and narrated by Christopher Buehlman. I had no idea. I was like, for real? And then he goes into this performance with this accent. I don't even know how you would describe it. It's almost like Scottish, English.
Yeah, I was thinking
Irish.
kind of Scottish would be the closest.
And
to
at
it.
first I'm like, man, he's like really committing to the accent thing. I don't know like how long I can, go with this for, but he totally won me over. And I found myself missing it when it was over. It was truly rare that one, you get to hear an author perform their own work, but two, that they really swing for the fences, as they say, and actually delivered a genuine bona fide performance out of it. It was very almost thespian in nature. And did you know that Christopher Buehlman goes to Renaissance fairs like around the country and is like, he insults people? He's like a Renaissance guy that people pay to have
Like
him
a
insult
jester?
them. I think it's more like a roaster. But yeah, and I was like, that kind of makes sense.
We got to get him in a room, if he hasn't already been in a room with Christian Cameron, who goes by Miles Cameron when he writes fantasy, another incredible author of The Red Knight, Artifact Space, and many more. These two are both, I don't know how to say it without basically making a pun about it, but Renaissance men.
Yes, Christopher Buehlman literally so by going to all these Renaissance fairs. So you get a lot of that kind of diverse background and many talents kind of incorporated into your fantasy novel, and it starts with the vocal performance of Kinch Nishannon in this audiobook. And yeah, highly recommend checking out the audiobook as well. Something we probably should have said before the spoiler warning, but still relevant to right now. It was really, we've read Patrick Rothfuss narrate Slow Regard of Silent Things, and that was fun. And then we got to listen to Joe Abercrombie do a short story in Sharp Ends, which was fun.
Yeah.
But
Buellman's two inspirations right there.
Buellman's two inspirations, that's true. I
But I
still
think
haven't
he
heard George
does
do anything yet, but
no.
maybe one day.
Yeah. Still waiting on Tolkien as well to
There
break into
might
the
be
audiobook
recordings of
game
him
with
reading excerpts, like in lectures or something, but not like proper
Sure.
audiobook. I don't think audiobooks were a thing in those days.
No, I don't think so. But yeah, I think he surpasses his inspirations in terms of his ability as a narrator by quite a bit. There's a reason that Abercrombie has Pacey doing his work, who's incredible, and Rothman has Nick Podell doing his work. So yeah, it's scary when you think, okay, the main installment is going to be done by the author, but again, Buehlman knocked out of the park. So it benefits from the way the story is told is this first person storytelling style narration, right? He's talking to the reader, or in the case of the audiobook, the listener, directly and telling his story. He'll even have asides where he'll say like, oh yeah, and if this didn't happen, then I wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be hearing this story.
Right.
So
And he's like, if you haven't
it
fallen
benefits.
madly in love, I pity you. Like that kind of stuff. Like
Oh, it's so good.
he'll just like break that fourth wall every once in a while, almost like the chorus of a play or something. I don't know my play words very well, but like something in a play that does that, and it works, and it also fits. You have Kinch Nishanik, the main character, who is kind of like like whimsical but crass individual, and that kind of comes across in the performance as well, which not an easy thing to convey, and heart as well. And I think, well, when we start to get into the themes of this book, I think that's an important thing we kind of revisit, is just how both his performance and his voice as an author, that comes across so much. Like Kinch is a character who's having fun, telling crass jokes, making snippets, but lives in a very grimdark world, and somehow you manage to find heart in that somewhere, and I think that's kind of the magic of this book, and in those of his performance and his voice.
Definitely, Charles. I think that this sits firmly with some of these books that have been coming out really in the 2020s, I would say, where they exactly what you're bringing up, this grimdark world in which the author is unafraid to be uncynical with the approach of the characters and their triumphs and their actual willingness to be optimistic about things and not just have it beat the crap out of them immediately. It's like these abilities to eke out these little victories. And I would say that after all of the crap that Kinch went through, Kinch and his crew, it is a pretty optimistic ending. It is I would say, a like mostly happy ending. Even the worst thing that happens, I would say, is that like Norgal dies, but also kind of doesn't die because she was dead legs the whole time. So even that, it's like, okay, really, the way things ended, like they accomplished their goal, and none of them really died, like dead forever died. So, I mean, unless you count Malk, R.I.P. Malk, who
You gotta
we should
count
get to,
Malk.
because that was such an awesome scene. That was like, I don't know, that might be the most memorable scene from the book for me.
When he dies?
When he dies, the like tug of war scene.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
oh my
right.
god.
And just
But,
like the
yeah.
kind of throwaway crazy nature of that moment too, which is like, okay, you survive krakens and goblin ships, just
And the duel to the death.
Yeah,
and then
duel
the
to
guy
the
who's
death.
trying to kill you is like tugging on your boot to try to keep you alive, and you just like a character that ended up pretty much a like I don't know, main character, but like a main part of the crew.
Yeah,
Like
part of the fellowship.
principal secondary character, part of the fellowship. It's like he dies just like completely needlessly in like this stupid tug of war that like between him and a goblin, and it's like, and he gets eaten alive. It's like, I think does a really good job. Like Buehlman is very patient with that. Like he builds Malk as a character, and almost there seems to be some redemption happening for him. And then it's just like, oh nope, he just dies like that because this is the world that we're living in.
Right.
And just like what a brutal scene is so good though. Like the willingness to go that way and have that sort of death that like is pointless, but that's the point.
Exactly. I mean, imagine like someone like Vegeta or like what's his face from Avatar, because I have to bring up Avatar every episode now.
Avatar: The Last Airbender, or Avatar: The James Cameron
Zuko. It's like Vegeta. Life is like an episode of Avatar.
Right.
It's like Vegeta or Zuko, but instead of like being redeemed and making it to the end, it's like they start to get redeemed, and you're getting interested and invested, and then they just die needlessly and horrifically in a pointless dispute that everyone could have just walked away from. And you're like, what? Whoa, what is this that we're dealing with right now? And it's all part of the lore of this book. And I think we can get into what I think is one of the main themes of this book now, which is like, look, life can be like a unforgiving, miserable, flippant place, and you just have to find happiness where you can. You have to kind of live for these moments that are like making life worth living, and embrace those and chase after those. And I think you get that when he's, Kinch like reflects on his relationship with what's his face, Malk, right? And is kind of almost like willing to forgive him, even though they did have a fight to the death, even though he was almost killed a bunch of times and Malk called him out on being a coward for avoiding the Goblin Wars and this and that. They still managed to form sort of a friendship, and Kinch was like enjoying the memories that he has and works him into his own warped sense of humor as he continues to cope with this insane world that he lives in. And he makes it work, and even though it looks like the cards are stacked against him at many times, he finds a way, both literally and metaphorically, because he's good at the card game too.
Yes, he is good at the card game for all the good it did him in the end. End up going rough for him anyway, despite his ability and luck. But yeah, along that theme that you bring up, Charles, I think there's the moment toward the end of the book, and Buehlman does an incredible job of building up like how, I guess, important a part of the world and its ethos, this idea of horses being gone, and how the goblins supposedly like killed all the horses or got rid of all the horses, and that's one of the reasons that they hate them. Of course, it was just the guild hoarding the horses, but either way, you've got that as a key part of the story throughout. And then finally, when they're able to like get these horses out from like the way that they're magically stored inside the giant, there's this moment where Kinch is looking at it and he goes, a horse, a real and actual horse I had brought back into the world under my own hand. If I died the very next day, and it didn't seem unlikely, I'd done something, hadn't I? And I wish I could do that in the Buehlman Scottish accent, but I won't. I won't even try because I'll shame myself. But that's, to me, those kind of moments are the key ones that establish what the theme is here, which is like, okay, I could easily die the next day. This is such a messed up world. But wow, like my life has been meaningful, if for nothing else than like this contribution I've made. And I think like all the characters, or a lot of the characters anyway, are finding ways to make their lives meaningful and to try to eke out those small victories like we've been talking about.
It's absolutely true. And he also manages to find love. He also manages to make this unlikely friendship with Galva. It even reminds me of when they're in locked up on the goblin ship, which is one of the tougher scenes to read. There's two scenes in this book that I would say are tough to read, and that's the first one where, you know, the goblin's getting ready to cook up the first guy, and the rest of them are just trying to, like, avoid the horror that's playing out right in front of them of a guy getting butchered alive to be eaten by goblins, and they just, you know, look at each other and sing songs and try and come together. And even the guy who was getting killed was able to sing a little bit. And then I believe they mentioned that the goblin like hit him in the head and that killed him or something. So he didn't have to get like butchered alive. But I mean, I think that's what happened. And so you're like, okay, there's these little victories, there's these little moments of survival and compassion and camaraderie that come through even in these flippin' dark moments that this book takes you through. And I, at the end of this, am having a hard time saying it's like a fully grimdark novel. And I know we talked about this as a conversation point of like, even when you have a book where like Kinch loses constantly and the odds are constantly stacked against him, he maintains his optimism and his sense of humor and his like he's open to love, because like Kinch gets married to Norrigal after the goblin thing, so he's
a moon wife, Charles.
Yes, moon wife for a month. And he's making it work, and I really like that. And to me, I would almost consider this book like an odyssey, if you will. It reads like one where you're going through all these different adventures and you're taken to all these different scenes: a witch's castle, a whaling ship, a goblin prison, all of these places you're being taken, and I'm in a mountain with giants and all this other crazy stuff. And through it all, you've got Kinch Nishanik at the center of it, and it's dark and it's horrific at times, but it never stops being fun and it never stops being hopeful, and that's what I think makes me enjoy the book so much.
That's really well said, Charles. Yeah, I totally agree. It seems like it's got that. I don't know if I exactly want to compare it to John Gwynn's work, like John Gwynn's The Shadow of the Gods, because I think there's a lot of things that are very different about their writing styles and all that.
Yeah.
But this idea of being willing to put that like hopefulness and that more heartwarming stuff in the middle of a place that is so dreary and grimdark in its feel. But I'll say the quote that most defines the Blacktongue Thief for me, and really delivers, because there's all these times throughout the book where Kinch like pisses or craps himself, or will sometimes he literally does,
yes,
which you almost never see from a protagonist in a fantasy novel. You see it all the time from other characters, but very rarely. It like took me by surprise,
but for different reasons.
Yeah, fair. But you know what I'm saying? Like,
right,
it's
yes,
very rare, even in the grimdark novels, even the times where we're trying to be realistic about these things, Charles.
Oh, great.
Even in those times, you very rarely have like the main characters pissing themselves, and it kind of took me by surprise a little bit the first time, but then when it happens multiple times, I'm like, wow, this is really a thing.
Yeah.
And then like part of what makes it like weirdly foreshadowing sort of, or at least a moment that builds to something that like delivers extremely well, is there's this quote, because he's talking about like, oh, I was so scared, is right at the end, like, I was so scared I thought I might piss myself. And he says, but the difference between the strong and the weak isn't that the strong don't piss themselves, it's that they hitch their pissy pants up after and go through with it.
Right.
And it's like, that is Kinch, and I think like the themes of this book in a nutshell is like, oh yeah, it's almost like a more like a funny and crass way of putting the whole classic. You see this quote in one way or another in like every fantasy book now, but it's a classic like Ned Stark saying to Bran, like, that's the only time that a man can be brave is when he's scared, Bran. Like,
right.
that's the only time a man can show courage. And it's like the Buehlman way and the Kinch way of putting it is like, it's not about not pissing yourself. It's about once you piss yourself, get on and do the thing that you're scared
Hike
of.
those
And
pissy pants up.
hike those pissy pants up.
And you've nailed what makes this book so special, and that's Christopher Buehlman's voice. Like the way he can turn a phrase and address the audience and flip a narrative and keep the story moving and entertaining at all times is absolutely incredible. We could open this book to any page. Like I'm gonna open it somewhere random, and you could almost be guaranteed to find something flippin' hilarious. And it's here. I just opened to a random page. I'm just going to pick a random line. Truth be told, it was too easy stealing here. People were so cowstruck watching souls quit their bodies. They were like simpletons. So I challenged myself to do something harder. I started stalking a merchant's fancy boy for his gold boot anklet, trying to work out how to kneel down without being noticed. But then they led the killer onto the gibbet, and my breath caught in my throat. It's like the way he's able to tell a story. He could have just said, and then I watched like a guy I watched someone I knew approach the, guillotine or whatever. But what happens instead is he's like, oh, I'm in the middle of thieving, and there are all these cowstruck watching souls. It's like, what? Like every sentence is
Who thinks of saying
so
stuff
rich
like that,
with
but
these
it's just,
things where it's like
constant.
are you like a Renaissance poet? Where do you? But then he's also in a very modern, crude way of speaking too. So he kind of combines the two, and it's poetry.
It really is, Charles. It's like I don't even know what to compare his voice to, because it's, this book gets a lot of comparisons, we've said, to Kings of the Wild. It gets comparisons to Lies of Locke Lamora, and both of those books are hilarious in their own ways, but all of them are unique from each other, like Buehlman's voice, from Eames's voice, from Lynch's voice. It's like, I don't know. It's so unique the way that Buehlman writes. It's kind of, I'm curious to see, he's this well-established horror author. Like before he ever got into, this is his first fantasy book, and based on at least the number of Goodreads ratings, it's quickly become his most popular book. But his horror books are lauded. Like people love them who read more of that genre.
It made me want to
really
read Between Two Fires.
Between Two
Fires.
That
was a good one, and I'm like, I gotta read more of this man. And I would agree, Dylan, because even the back of the book says, "Begin the journey of a lifetime." Interesting. In this luminous and irreverent fantasy for fans of Nicholas Eames' Kings of the Wild and Joe Abercrombie's The Blade itself. I think it's interesting to invoke Kings of the Wild and The Blade itself, because Abercrombie has this way of turning a phrase also and being cynical but also funny, like Christopher Buehlman is. But I don't know, for whatever reason, Christopher Buehlman, I just picture like on a stage trying to entertain me when I hear the audiobook, like I really feel like he's performing and putting his heart out there, whereas Abercrombie, I definitely feel is more just like in the clever written word. I don't see him kind of like performance at any level. I don't know. It's just the way that, and then the commitment that Christopher Buehlman has to sticking with that witticism. Like Abercrombie will write battles and politics and bribery and this and that, but this book, by sticking to the first person and sticking to Kinch and like just moving along in his mind, it never stops being that whimsical funniness that I believe is why Eames is so tied to this. And Eames also gave a glowing review of this book. Holy hell, this book is awesome, is on the cover. That's a endorsement from Nicholas Eames.
I could see Eames loving this book for sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I could see him being a big fan. And rightfully so, because he's got a similar thing where he's not afraid of a penis joke here or there, and he's not afraid of just being funny and writing something that's cool for entertainment in your fantasy world. So I get that, but he does kind of stand alone. It's an interesting mix, and I guess that's the best you can do while shouting like some of the most popular authors in the genre. Like, that's a pretty good one, but I don't know, he stands kind of on his own here.
He does, yeah, because it's like he's got that dry ability to go like cynical with things that Abercrombie has for sure, and he has that, I guess, that wit that I associate with Abercrombie too. But I do think it is more in your face in the humor, which leans a little bit more toward Kings of the Wild, which is, I think, a little bit more blatant in the use of its humor, a little more theatrical, I guess. But then it's almost got these inspirations that you do see from someone like Rothfuss, where like the only thing I could compare the use of like almost like it's like a one-man show.
Yes.
Right? You
yes.
say you imagine like Buehlman up there doing the voice of Kinch and giving this whole show. It's like Quoth is a very different character in the Kingkiller Chronicle, Rothfuss's famous series, but it is that idea that you could really imagine just like one person or one character just putting on a hell of a show for you and telling their story in their own unique voice in a way no one else could. And I get that from Quoth, of course, and when you listen to the audiobook, Nick Podell, you could imagine him just, he is Quoth, like just standing up and telling you that story the way Quoth does. And then in this book by Buehlman, you actually get the author himself, who, like, to me, is Kinch putting on that one-man show.
For sure. It's that's well said, and I think that first person, a la the Patrick Rothfuss, kind of nailed home what I was trying to figure out for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because right off the bat, I guess Rothfuss seemed like almost a surprising inspiration for Buehlman to list. I think I saw Abercrombie a little bit easier in there. But then, yeah, when you think about this use of the storytelling first-person narrative and having a fantastic storyteller, like addressing, in this case, the reader directly. In the Kingkiller Chronicle, it feels like they're addressing the reader directly, but obviously Quoth is addressing the chronicler there to write down his story, but it produces the same effect, just with totally different characters.
I also think I could go back to its poetry. Like, Rothfuss's writing is super poetic. Abercrombie's is not. And Christopher Buehlman's is, and it's poetic, but it's not like, and then I like pulled in the moon and tried to claim her. It's something ridiculous half the time, you know? I'm going to pull open another random page here. Oh, this is from when Kinch and Malk were fighting to the death. I should have known you'd fight like this. It's fit for goblins. No honor. Never had it. Never claimed it, I said. Coward. Guilty. Slipper. As in slipped the muster. Guilty. Effing biter. That meant goblin. I knew that's what he meant, but in my pain and exhaustion, it struck me angry because I'd passed up more than one opportunity to bite him. I could have had his nose off or an ear or a chunk of his neck a dozen times, so to hell with him. I bit him. I bit the shite out of him. He yelled and drooled more, started biting my arm in return. It's like...
It's so funny. It's so
funny, but it's
That's
poetic.
a particularly great part, I think, too. Yeah, but it is like you say, right? It's like if you take some of this Rothfuss ability to write prose, but you remove all the, like... I don't know how to describe it, like this desire to make everything like romantic, I guess. Like there's a romantic feeling to Abercrombie's book. I don't just mean that in the sense of I said Abercrombie. I meant Rothfuss. There's this romantic feeling, like you're saying, where Quoth is telling these stories about the moon or the way that he speaks about Denna and all this stuff.
It's
And
tragic.
there's this
And
like pragmatism to the way that you'll see even in similar situations where the way Kinch feels about Norgal is almost similar to the way that Quoth feels about Denna. Like there is that
I
same
guess so.
like almost like because he has this almost like the way he speaks about her is almost like worship, you know.
Mm.
But he's it's in Kinch's voice, and he can't really he doesn't really express it with the same level of I guess romance. It's a little crass, more crass, as we've said, and it's more pragmatic, and I would say realistic too.
Absolutely. It's kind of a different tone, but with the same kind of skill and attention to detail. Say one thing about Christopher Buehlman. When he writes his scat and piss lines, he puts a lot of thought into them and works that phrase and turns it around just right and calls back to it and wraps it up at the end, and he sends you home with a lesson. And that's artistry right there. Not easy to do. And the fact that you're willing to commit your artistry to like that kind of humor is just, it's beautiful.
It is beautiful, Charles. Well, you read that hilarious line from the fight between Malk and Kinch, and I have to bring up something that's really cool in this book: the use of monsters. We've talked
Mm.
about this a few times recently. Like monsters are coming back.
Oh
It's a
yeah.
monster renaissance here, and this is the Blacktongue Thief is no exception to like bringing those monsters back. You gotta love when like a kraken can just come out of nowhere and start wreaking havoc on while they're on the ship, and it just makes the epicness of this story even greater. It's so exciting when that stuff happens. You got krakens, you've got giants, you've got like these sort of like demon things. I guess it was like a golem,
Yeah.
and it's yeah, and supposedly elves, but didn't really get to see that.
Giants.
And of course, yes, and of course, goblins
Oh
who
my
eat
gosh, yeah.
people's flesh, and it's it's really exciting. And those kind of things, they always feel when they're done this well. It's like a love letter to the fantasy genre because monsters are such a crucial part of its history. And there's a while where things, I would say, almost following George, even though George, of course, has his own like monsters, I guess you could say, but at least like mythical creatures in there. Following George, it felt like there's this a lot of people using a lot less monsters. Dragons, of course, are always a mainstay, so you'll see them all the time. But I think like we've been underusing some of these like creatures like krakens in the genre. It's so great to see them used here.
For sure. And it's not like it has to be a book about krakens. It's like we went out to sea at one point in this odyssey and the kraken was there, you know? It's you can your book can be fun. You can put as many monsters in it as you want. You don't have to like make it about that, and they don't have to be suspense and mythical and all these other things. They can just be creatures in your world. And I agree that the way he uses them is so funny. I kind of remember it was like so interestingly put when they're on the island and they see the goblin ship, and then the goblins are like breaching, and he goes, I saw my first goblin. I was like, what an interesting thought to have when you're like in fear of your life. But there's something like novel about that, and it's fun, and it adds to the adventure aspect of this story, which I think has gone underpraised in this book. I mean, they call it a journey of a lifetime, but I would more say like an odyssey of an adventure. Like it does have that feel to it. He in this tiny book, he goes through a whole lot of different environments and settings and encounters all kinds of exotic creatures and cultures, and it's a really and honest. Can I just say also it's like the perfect length for a fantasy book.
Yeah.
Can I just say how perfect the length of this book was? It's like barely 400 pages, and you're like, mwah. Beautiful. Does not overstay its welcome. Does not stay on one plot line or character or scene for too long. Like, the book moves, ends just in time. Beautiful, beautiful skill that it takes real restraint and finesse to pull off. I feel like some people it's like, I'll write a 1,000-page giant chihuahua killer. And it's like, you don't have to do that. You can write a 400-page, barely in my hardcover, masterpiece.
I totally agree, Charles. I think it's an interesting idea, right? Because you talked about how much ground gets covered in this book, juxtaposed against the book being relatively short for a fantasy novel. And how does he do that? I think, it's about simplicity, both in being character focused, and it's like, this is really Kinch's story. We get Galva, we get Norgal, but really this is Kinch's story more than anything. And we also, what I really like is the straightforward plot, in the sense that, like, it's very clear what their motivation is, and except before Kinch really knows what his motivation is.
Yeah.
Like, but in terms of, once we know his motivation and he finds out it himself, it's one thing, right? They're going to go try to save Maria, who's the queen of Hispanthia. And then that just gives Buehlman the freedom to say, okay, they're doing this. What kind of obstacles do I want to put in their way? And how can I make this an enjoyable, as you say, Charles, odyssey for these characters? And he has so much freedom to work there, because it's not all this complex politicking or whatever.
Although there is kind of with
this,
the guilds and this and that.
Sure, but we're not privy to those conversations playing out.
No.
And I think that is what's beautiful about this, because we're telling Kinch's story, and all that stuff is, of course, happening around him, but we don't have to be sitting there in the small council chamber every time that, like, the guild is deciding what they're going to do and how they're going to react to the queen and blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's secondary to just telling this awesome tale. And I think it benefits a lot by doing that. Like, we love those things. We love A Song of Ice and Fire, and that is so much about that. But
I mean, we just got off of reading
nice.
Oathbringer, where how many times did they have war meetings to talk about the plot and what was happening? And I mean, that book exists for that reason. Like, that's what makes those books good, but it also is what makes them 1,400 pages long. So
yeah, restraint is not Sanderson's strong suit.
Right.
He has a lot of great strengths, Brandon Sanderson, and the Stormlight Archive definitely features many of them. But there are times when you're reading that 1,200-page book where you're thinking, you know what? Did we need this scene? And that never happens in The Blacktongue Thief. There's not a single scene that I would cut out from this book. I mean, I enjoyed all of it.
I totally agree. I think you nailed it in terms of, like, keeping the, like, main plot simple, keeping it focused on one POV, first person. I also want to give credit to, you know, how many times do authors talk about the skill of show, don't tell? Christopher Buehlman is the, like, master of showing. I even, like, there's a scene I remember where they're in the goblin prison, and, you know, that horrible scene is about to happen. Without saying anything, all he says is, like, and then, like, what happened next made me hate goblins, and anyone who lives with goblins can bugger off, or something. He obviously wrote it much better than that. I couldn't find the quote, but
I remember the line you're talking about, though, where he's like, he's basically saying anyone who, like, tries to defend goblins, like, I won't listen to a word of it now because of what I've seen. And I'll see if I can find it.
And how much more powerful is saying something like that than going on and on and on about how bad goblins are, and then them having a conversation. Like, imagine Kinch and Norgal having a conversation later about it, and then Kinch being like, and I hate goblins after what we've been through, and anyone like who sympathizes with them is horrible. It's like, no, we didn't have to set up a conversation. We didn't have to write a scene. We just had a moment in the narration that was so eloquent and said more than its words, which Buehlman is doing almost every sentence. Like, he invokes images and emotions, and he implies plot points and directions and tones so well and in so few words that it's kind of his skill. I think it's an underrated skill, this ability to be able to put you in a scene and put you in a mood with a character-driven line of prose. Like, that is the goal. That is the dream, from at least for me, as someone who loves both characters and prose, to be able to be like, oh my gosh, that was beautifully, beautifully done. And I feel like we don't get that in so many fantasy books because the focus is on world building and everything like that, which I love, and that's great, and those are great for that reason. But so refreshing to get a story that can evoke emotion and tone so fast while also at the same time develop your character. Skill, skill, skill.
So much skill, Charles. And I think I found the quote here. It's going to be a tough one for FTF's family-friendly rating here.
As
but,
it is in this book.
I'm going to say, having some trouble with this one, much like we had with the Lies of Locke Lamora. Well, how do you get that book across?
That's another worthy comparison.
Right. But I'll use the letter F to describe a 4-letter word that starts with F that I'm sure you're all familiar with.
Let's hear it.
And yeah, it's I'll start here. One of his teeth cut me just the tiniest bit, a goblin obviously, and he rubbed salt grains and a little bit of blood that came out, fingered it up, and went back to his steam making, licking that finger like it was the best finger in the world. F him, F all goblins forever, and F any who make peace with them. If you don't yet understand why, heed the next bit, heed it, and know it to be true. And that's
the end of the chapter, right?
That's the end of the chapter.
So then going into the next chapter,
so it's like,
this is going to be some stuff.
This is going to be brutal.
Yeah, and it was.
And I think it's that, I think he probably brings that in from his horror background, that ability to build suspense, where you just don't see that to the same extent in fantasy usually, where it's like you really get to get people. It's not quite like, it's not terror, it's not quite horror, any of that, although it's definitely gruesome and like tough to read, as you said earlier. But he, I think, uses that skill where it's like, there's so much done by saying, like, what he just said there. It's like, yeah, here it comes. This is going to be brutal. Yeah. And he delivers on it, of course, with that scene. Although it's really interesting with the singing. It's almost like cinematic, right? You could really imagine that scene. And props to Christopher Buehlman for his singing in the narration of the audiobook. I mean, that is
right.
That's another thing he's bringing back into vogue is the songs, right? That's that Tolkien.
I was like, wow, he legit has Tolkien-esque songs in here.
Yeah.
And he does thank Tolkien, and we kind of underserved that. Tolkien has a bit of horror in his own way, where he's talking about like the drums in the deep, they're coming, and they're reading like the journal of a corpse in this chamber that the Fellowship are locked in. That's kind of scary and is a way of building suspense and letting you know you're in a spooky scene without telling you, because it's all done through the characters and like the setting. So there's similar things there. And the music, like, how many times have we had these wonderful line breaks? And another reason to listen to the audiobook is so that you know how the Bully Boy song goes. That's very important. I'm glad I caught that on the audiobook, so you know when to go, rah, rah, Bully Boy, rah. I do that all the time now, and I just am like, want to shout something. That's what I've been shouting lately.
You've been shouting "rah rah bully boy rah"
I mean, not in
at
public,
people.
but yes.
Oh God, your poor fiance, Charles. Your poor fiance.
Yeah, it's true.
It's that is a really interesting throwback though, the songs, and I'll say songs in fantasy can drive me nuts. Like the songs in the original Lord of the Rings books were really difficult for me
Yeah,
to get
yeah.
through.
Those
I'll
you
be real
can,
with
those
you.
you kind of skip. I skip those. Not gonna lie.
Yeah. But yeah, and I recommend doing the same unless you're like a real Tolkien head. But Buehlman songs that do not skip, and if anything, we need like a full album. We need the songs just back to back to back, and we need a Spotify playlist at the very least, Charles.
And it's not just like a hobbit standing up in the middle of dinner and singing like a
Right.
3-page song, and everyone's like, it's just a random thing to do. They're actually happening, whether they're trying to like muffle the noises of goblins eating somebody, or whether they're drunk at a bar, or and they sing that song, and then the cat comes in, and then now the cat is named Bully Boy, and
Yep.
Bully Boy the cat, it makes frequent appearances. And yeah, no, the songs were great. I never thought someone could get me to like fantasy songs, but this is a great showing for fantasy songs, and maybe they'll come back in vogue.
Maybe they will. And you mentioned Bully Boy, the cat, inspired by a cat
I
that
saw
Buehlman
that was
himself.
sweet.
Yeah, it's sad though. Is he actually had a blind cat come to his doorstep in 2015, and yeah, he absolutely loved that cat, it sounds like, and unfortunately the cat only lived a few years, but he is immortalized in this book, and isn't that just nice? A cat has a legacy forever, Charles.
Right.
Luther, I believe,
And
was the name.
yes, Luther.
Yes.
That's in the acknowledgments. He goes, lastly to Luther, he showed up on my doorstep in the summer of 2015 and rowed to be let in. He was a handsome boy, but sickly, with only a few short years to give. Though his eyes didn't work, I had been the blind one and had never loved a cat. He taught me a few things about that, and there's a picture of the cat. So sweet.
Oh, so cute.
It's kind of a silly picture. The cat's kind of like wide-eyed. But no, I love Bully Boy. And I'm glad that they were able to work Bully Boy in a way that, like, okay, there's a reason why he keeps coming back and is indestructible. Like, it's not like, oh, isn't it funny that the blind cat just keeps popping up? Like, isn't that hilarious? Which I think this book could have totally gotten away with doing and would have been fun. But the fact that it's like part of the narrative that you have an assassin hiding in there to kind of keep tabs on Kinch is funny.
Keep tabs.
Like a tabby cat. You got that?
Tabby.
That was intentional.
Was that on purpose? So that's the kind of content you're gonna get from Charles on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, and no one else from no other podcast. Those cat puns. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good recommendation for cat companion fans, like, which is interesting. It's like coming into vogue also now. Like the first binding, also a book by R.R. Verdi, which was a pretty popular book, very Kingkiller Chronicle-esque, that one. And that one was published in 2022. Also has a cat companion that features heavily in like the back half of the book. So it's, I don't know. I feel like there might be another one that came out relatively recently that did it too, but I can't remember. Either way, interesting. And I think cat fans rejoice because there's a lot to love for you in the Blacktongue Thief.
Cat fans rejoice indeed. And yeah, I think like those last lines where he's like, I'll keep carrying you for a bit, but if you shite on me, it's over, I told Billy. He didn't reply. So, Bully, I said, are we going to be killed in the giant lands? He said nothing. Would you like to see Galtia someday? Nothing. Well, he wasn't much at prophecy, but I was glad all the same for his warmth and goodwill. It's like, that's sweet,
Charles, you do a good Kinch.
Well, I listened to him for hours. Maybe I picked up a little bit.
I know, but I listened to him for hours and I could not. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying. That's a good Kinch.
Reckless, abandoned, and even then I knew I'm. Buehlman stands alone.
You've been practicing. You've been singing by yourself. in that accent, yeah, any more of that and we're gonna get sued. So you got about one verse you're allowed to do on the podcast without paying. But Charles, I think we'd be remiss not to talk at least some about Galva, who's a character that they're the only character besides Kinch that really gets mentioned in the back of the book style description. And she's also going to be the main character of an upcoming prequel. I don't know if you knew that, Charles.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so the way I heard it was that Buehlman went out to write a sequel, and he found that there were too many unanswered questions he had about Galva as a character, and he decided, okay, I guess I'm going back and I'm writing a prequel. That she's a survivor of the Goblin Wars, so we're probably going to get some of that, and that's going to be the next
death.
Yes, we're going to get. That's the next installment we're going to get in this world, which bums me out in some ways. Obviously, I'll read it. I'll read anything Buehlman puts out in the fantasy genre because I love this book. But I'm gonna miss Kinch.
Yeah, me too.
And yeah, so it's that part's a bummer, but I'm sure it'll be great. And
Galva's a great character, but almost is the straight man or straight woman, I guess, to Kinch.
Exactly. So I don't know. Maybe Buehlman can add a sort of another funny character or whatever to bounce off of Galva. But yeah, I just figured we should chat Galva a little bit. I think I left the book kind of feeling the same way it sounds like Buehlman felt when he went to write this sequel. It's like Galva's intriguing. There's this almost cryptic aspect to her as a character. It's we just don't know that much about her. And there's just multiple times where there are these reveals that it's oh, wow, there's so much more than meets the Ida character. But meanwhile, that can also leave you feeling like there's not as much development as you might like for the only other character that really, I guess gets advertised as a part of the book, right? Because I remember I asked you in the Friends Pitching Fantasy episode, I'm like, oh, so it sounds like it's this misfits, Kinch and Galva, best friends forever, 100 years, Kinch and Galva. I'm cringing at myself for making a Rick and Morty reference now.
Especially these days.
But yeah, these days the fan base has taken a hit in their reputation. I'm not even caught up on Rick and Morty, and obviously we don't condone the actions of one of its producers who's now no longer affiliated with it. But all that aside,
actors,
yeah, the voice actor of both Rick and Morty, who I don't know all the details of what he did, but sounds like did some extremely messed up things. Either way, was that joke worth it? Probably not. Probably not if it derailed the conversation that much.
Say though, because even in the book,
can I finish? Yes, I'm gonna finish. So point being, I asked you do we get any comments from reviews that you've read or anything about these two characters as being one of the best duos in fantasy, the way that we always get with Locke and Jean in Liza Lamora, and you said I wasn't really seeing much of that, and I get it because it feels more like a fellowship than a duo for sure, and I don't know. They don't really have that back and forth at the level of the great duos, and Galva doesn't get the level of development that a character like Jean gets in The Lies of Locke Lamora. So,
Right.
yeah, Charles, your thoughts?
My thought is, I'm kind of the same way. I was reading, before we read the book, and I was working on my pitch to you for it, and I was reading the description. It's funny going back to that description now, and I'm like, is that really what this book was about? And
Totally agree.
it's something like, but today, Kinch Nishanik has picked the wrong mark. Galva is a knight, blah, 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 searching for a queen, missing, which is all true. But it says, unsuccessful in his robbery and lucky to escape with his life, Kinch now finds his fate entangled with Galva's common enemies, blah, 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 and honors a luxury if you
It's
can
like
afford.
technically true.
I mean, like, that's what happened, but it's not like he tried to rob someone and then they kind of forced him into this crazy adventure because she's, this powerful, supernatural type person. Not quite the mark, I thought. And I guess that, how many times is the cover ever right when trying to
Well, yeah, the
represent
authors
something as
rarely
nuanced
are
as a
involved
fantasy
in.
book, right?
Yeah, the back of the book is not typically written by
And then
the
it says
author.
the
in a
smallest
traditionally
mistake
published
could
book.
become your biggest adventure.
It's like that's not really. I've really
What
felt that ever
mistake?
since we read this book. Yeah, well, the mistake was trying to rob
But he's a
Galva.
thief.
I get
Like,
it's
he's gonna
like
rob people. There was no
Yeah.
mistake. Like, he survived, and then
Well,
he went back to her and got her to
robbed the wrong
convince him
person.
to. But he was the one that convinced her to let him tag along.
yeah.
Like, they should have
Yeah,
said
no, I'm
something
not arguing
like
for it.
Kinch
I'm
just couldn't help himself, and like, something like that. You'd get the sense of like, here's a guy who's like tempting fate all the time and making the best of it or something. But yeah, your thoughts.
Yeah, I've just felt this kind of where I was trying to lead this conversation too with the Galva talk. I feel like this book is like just not really advertised in the way I would choose to, I guess.
Yeah.
And I need to like stop and actually, obviously it's not my job to advertise this book or like I'm not his publicist or his agent or whatever. Like, but I came away like loving this book, but not for the reasons I was expecting to going in based on the way that it's advertised, I guess. And I think, yeah, there's just got to be a better way to put it. If anything, I feel like Norrigal was like a more featured character in this book than Galva was, or at least
Yeah.
like got more development than Galva. And Norrigal is not mentioned at all. The idea that you were talking about of this, like, it's an epic adventure. Like, this isn't really like quest fantasy.
Yeah, you don't want to invite people looking for quest fantasy and then surround them with shite jokes and brutal horror moments and all that. Yeah.
And even the Kings of the Wild comparisons, like, we've made some ourselves, of course, but it's just like, I don't know, so much more. It's like dirtier. It's like dirtier. It's grimier. Like, I don't know. Eames is like hilarious, but he's kind of sillier. I feel like not that this isn't silly, but
And
it's
he's
like
way more PG-13.
yes, exactly. That's I guess what I'm trying to get at. Like, there are things that happen in this book that would never ever come close to happening in the Nicholas Eames book, at least in Kings of the Wild. Who knows what Eames might produce in the future? But yeah, it's just I don't come away like oh, I'm gonna recommend this to all Kings of the Wild fans.
No,
Like,
no.
Yeah, that's not where I'm coming away from this. I'd sooner recommend it to an Abercrombie fan than I would.
I'd sooner recommend it to a Scott Lynch fan. I'd sooner
Definitely.
because Lynch will go there sometimes with the violence and the assaults and all that kind of stuff. He'll go there, and Abercrombie will go there too. But I mean, Buehlman goes way further than either of them. But at least Lynch can curse like a master.
Does
Buehlman's
Buehlman go
right up
way
there.
further than Abercrombie?
I mean,
I don't think I would say that.
with the whole being eaten alive stuff and the whole like R word
Abercrombie has
stuff.
like detailed torture
He is
scenes.
detailed
It's
torture
just
scenes. That's
different.
fair. That's fair.
I don't think Buellman goes way farther, just in a different direction. He goes maybe the same distance as Abercrombie, but yeah. I mean, the point being, something like Kings of the Wild, I need to know a few more things about what you're interested in and what you're okay with before I start going toward like, oh, you got to read the Blacktongue Thief.
Right.
Like you said, if you love Liza Locklemore, I'm a little more comfortable. Like, okay, yeah, this you'll be able to handle the stuff that's happening in this book, and of course, you love the rogue characters.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's just people kind of grouping recent fantasy that's funny, but also not like Terry Pratchett funny, where like the plot doesn't matter and like,
and I mean, you
it doesn't
have
take itself
even
seriously at
Eames
all.
giving full blurbs and raving on this book, so I see that. I will give it credit. The book is beautiful. Like the title's great. The jacket is gorgeous. It's got they've picked the perfect authors to combine in terms of like piquing my interest anyway with Hobb, Abercrombie, Eames, Glenn Cook, Brent Weeks, and even one of these other authors said fans of Lies of Locklemore will love this one. So they did a good job of invoking, even though I wouldn't say any of them are like as direct of a comparison as the book is implying. I would say they're all fair game and all in the mix, and it's a very tempting mix as well. So it does that for me, but the blurb itself, like it talks like these two people had this unlikely collision and now they're being pulled on an adventure. It's like, not really. I mean, this is a guy who's in student debt basically and has to commit crimes. Like that's would be a much more interesting but maybe too satirical kind of explanation of what's happening here. This really is a story about how evil student debt is, by the way. I don't know if you picked up on that. But
I guess I thought about it briefly. I don't know if I would quite say it's a story about that. But going on the topic we're just talking about, the cover also features just two people walking together and, of course, Bully Boy in the back.
mm-hmm.
So, again, like that's not an image that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about this book. Like, I'm thinking about Kinch and Galva and Norgal and Malk, weirdly, like
Right.
all together. Or I don't know, it could have been any number of people on the ship or anything like that. There's so many other people who are like central parts of this. So I don't know. I don't understand why it's pitched like it's this buddy cop, like odd couple thing when that's not all what it is.
He was
you're
a
right.
thief
I think
and she was a warrior who worshipped the goddess of death. An unlikely
crazy
duo.
shenanigans. Yeah, what
Getting
might
into
this
crazy
unlikely duo
adventure.
get up to?
Yeah.
And it's like that's
That's the antics of Kinch and Galva.
Yeah, you know it.
Tom and Jerry, Royce and Adrian, Kinch and Galva.
I don't think Tom and Jerry had the kind of relationship you think they had, Charles.
Just that they're an
you
iconic
think Tom and
duo.
Jerry are like, sure. Name a better duo. I'll wait. Tom and Jerry. I think that it's just an odd thing, but I think you're right when you say the right authors are being evoked.
Yes.
Even if not necessarily always for the reasons that we would mention them for, but they're definitely kind of the people in the sphere. And it's a testament to Buellman's writing and how unique his story and unique his voice is, that like you struggle to really make the necessary comparisons or really get across like what is this about, who is this for, because it's different. It's different than anything we've seen before. So you grasp at like, oh well, you might like thieves, you might like rogues, you might like that like dry comedic wit of Joe Abercrombie. You might like that funny style that Eames has. It's like you're kind of grasping at all of that, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, you've got a fantastic novel that is unlikely to let anyone down anyway.
What that is truly well said. I think you're trying to compare something unique to like shout lines that audiences would find recognizable, and so you have to kind of make a few you just kind of have to do your best with that. And then look, this book succeeded. It caught our attentions, and we picked it over many others, and we loved it. So it was well done in that regards. I guess we're nearing our time here. I want to make sure we have time to discuss anything else in particular that came up on your reading journey of a lifetime, as the back of the book says. If there's anything else you wanted to make sure we mentioned in this episode.
I'll just say I think it's interesting the threads that he chose to leave hanging. I guess he knew that there were going to be more stories left in this world. I think that this book works as a standalone, but there's all these mysteries that are still yet to uncover.
Right.
And I'd really like eventually, I know I'm in Buehlman, we're trusting here that the prequel is the choice that makes sense next, but I really want a sequel. I want to move forward from here because there's so much more to tell, and we need more Kinch. It's gonna be bittersweet having an installment without him. So yeah, moving forward, I'll read that prequel for sure.
Yes.
And I can't wait for hopefully that sequel does end up coming out once he's sufficiently answered the questions he has left about Galva.
That's well said. I kind of remember you asking me, is this a standalone or part of a series? And even having not read it, I was like, I can kind of tell that this was, and I think you had said this phrase, a standalone with sequel potential. Like, that's kind of how you how new authors kind of have market their books these days as a way to like get out there in front of new readers. Say, hey, it's only one book and you can read it and it's good, but hopefully I get you hooked and you want to read more and more and more. And I think that's this book in a nutshell. Like, it's like a perfect standalone, and I think it's listed as a standalone, although I've seen now in parentheses Blacktongue 1. I don't know if that's actually the name, like Blacktongue is the name of the series, but we'll see.
That would be interesting.
There's way too many.
The next book does not include the Blacktongue Thief himself. It's supposed to be called The Daughter's War. And Buehlman said, I'm a slow writer, be patient, and I'll try to craft you something worthy. So we'll be patient.
That absolutely. And I can tell that, you have to put some time and thought, even though you're writing scat jokes at times and other things, you get being silly. I can tell he puts a lot of thought into this, and a lot of editing and a lot of refinement to get to a voice like this one in as few pages as this one. Like, even, I guess the prose I would compare it most directly to is Rothfuss, and Rothfuss's books are huge. Like, this book is way smaller. So yeah, I can see, and Rothfuss, as we all know, takes a long time to craft each book, and we respect
No, not Rothfuss.
What am I talking about?
Quick.
Hopefully he'll take faster than Rothfuss, and given his publication history so far, I think he stands a good chance of doing that. But if
I think he's underselling and he'll over-deliver.
I think so as well. It can be hard to follow up something that got, like, Nicholas Eames says, holy hell, this book is awesome. It's like, at one point that's great, but the second point is like, well, thanks, Nicholas, now I have to write something that's just as awesome again next time. Like, how do I beat holy hell, this book is awesome? How do you beat that? I don't know, but
Yeah,
in
maybe
Buehlman we
Eames will
trust.
say, holy hell, this book is even more awesome.
Ooh.
Or they'll just do the thing that they always do with these kind of books and just repeat the same praise.
Yeah.
And it'll say,
Holy hell,
like,
this book is awesome.
praise
Nicholas
for
Eames.
the
Yeah.
Blacktongue series, you know? And
Right,
I
right.
have a feeling, holy hell, this book is awesome, is going to make another feature
Or you could get
on
like a
another
really
cover.
vague, like he probably barely glanced at a George R. R. Martin endorsement. Like, Buehlman is a strong writer.
Yeah, I think we've kind of, there's a time there, Charles, where it felt like that was every single fantasy book. Like right when the Game of Thrones show was biggest, it was like the way that you try to sell a book is just a vague,
George R. R. Martin
brief
called it a
George R. R.
book.
Martin quote. Yes, George R. R. Martin noted, this is a fantasy book. And George R. R. Martin noted, Christopher
That'd be
Buehlman
bigger than the
seems
title
nice.
of the book, bigger than the author name.
Yeah. Right. Just trying to trick people into buying a book they think it has George as the author. Like, because George R. R. Martin is written so large on the cover.
Right.
But I think we have moved away from the vague George R. R. Martin like tagline for books, and we've moved toward the like you were talking about, Charles, grab folks who are kind of in that sphere. Brent Weeks in this one, Nicholas
Fantasy
Eames,
book
Anthony
review,
Ryan
Grimdark
is in
magazine.
there, Glenn Cook. Yeah, Grimdark Magazine's on here. It's like you grab all those. I actually think it's way better how this is done now because it's not that I'm really reading what the people are saying per se, because it's like, every once in a while you get something cool like, holy hell, this book is awesome. You're like, okay, Nick wouldn't say that. I mean, we know Nick from our interview. No, well, we did interview him, but Nick wouldn't say that if he's a friend of the show. He wouldn't say that if this book wasn't awesome. But then again, more what I'm doing when I look at a book, I'm like glancing at the authors and I'm kind of placing it like, okay, what kind of book is this? And they actually seem to be doing a pretty good job. I feel like I can look at most books and which authors are providing quotes, and more so that than what they're saying, and say, oh, this is that kind of book. And I think, yeah, you see that with something like this, where you're like, okay, it's definitely got some grimdark leanings for sure, but it's also funny.
Right.
Hence the Eames.
I think it's a grimdark world, but with a character that refuses to participate in the grimdark nature of the world that he's in. Sometimes you have the opposite, where it's like the epic fantasy world, but then the character is grimdark, and he's like, I'll betray you. Like, I don't care. Like, I don't need to be good all the time, or I don't need to want to save you, or this or that. Like, whether it's like, no, I'm choosing to love and make people laugh and have fun and, go a little bit out of my way to be silly and like challenge myself to be clever and this, that, and the other, even though all these characters are trying to eat him or kill him or assault him or something. It's like, no, I'm going to continue to persevere through it. And I think that's the interesting mix here. So is that grimdark? Probably yes, but it feels modern. It feels like a trend that I like to see.
Yeah, it does. And Kinch is interesting because you do have to call him a morally gray protagonist for sure.
Yes.
And he's a thief. And there are some moments or things he does that he's realistic about these things. Like, he's not like so honorable that he's not gonna fight Malk to the death for basically no reason or whatever. But he's also not so dark and like cynical that he's not gonna grab onto Malk and try his hardest to like pull him back during the tug of war.
There's that scene where he stabs the guy in the rowboat when they're escaping the Kraken, where he just sees that moment to kill somebody.
Yes.
But it wasn't...
that guy poisoned...
right. It wasn't malicious. I don't think he's particularly... No, he poisoned Galva because Galva was going to fight Malk. And then that person handed Galva like a bottle that was poisoned, I think, so she couldn't fight in the duel to death the next day. And so Kinch had to fight instead. I think that was that guy.
Yes. No, that's right. I was confusing it with like Bully Boy got like thrown overboard.
Oh yeah,
around that.
no,
time.
I think Malk was the one who threw Billy Boy over, or maybe it was the
Okay.
captain. That was a funny scene because
That was funny too,
you
yeah.
just knowing that assassin was in there too, like trying to escape, and it's like, oh, didn't have enough time, and something like, yeah, why would they let a cat stay on the ship for that long? Although I've
Right.
read that sometimes they had cats on ships to catch mice, and it was good luck or whatever.
Oh, that makes sense.
But
I've also heard this this is the like shipping life podcast with Charles and Dylan. I've also heard, or like animals on ships podcast. I've also heard like, I think it was like tortoises. I think it was like that were very common on ships.
I don't know.
They would, because
in the ship,
yeah, there's
A
something
tortoise
about
in the ship.
they would like eat. Yeah, this is like during the whaling times. I think they would take tortoises on the ships and they would eat them. I'm sorry. And
Turtle soup.
it's something with like how their bodies can store water, and they also don't have to, like a tortoise can like not eat for a year. And back then, because their metabolisms are so slow, this is like also possibly completely untrue. So fact check me before you quote me. But yeah, I'm pretty sure tortoises, their metabolisms are like so slow that they cannot eat for like a year. So you just take them out on the ship with you. I think
Cheap
back
livestock.
then they literally, they thought that tortoises didn't eat, like, 'cause or like didn't have to eat or something like that. So they would take them and they basically like eat them because you could keep this live.
Keep them
tortoise
alive
on
for
the ship.
3 months and then eat them, and you don't have to feed
Yeah.
them. So they're kind of
Exactly.
fuel efficient livestock.
Yes.
I choose to believe that that's true, and I bet it is.
Yep.
You can take that to
I
the bank.
choose to believe. Take it to the bank. And, while you're at the bank, you're going to want to grab a few bucks to go out and buy the prequel when it comes out.
What are the name of the coins
because
that he loves? I don't remember. The
coins he
galleons or
loves?
something? I don't know. I'm gonna.
Oh,
mess it up.
God.
Now that I've said this, but his favorite coin, the something silver something.
Yes,
Owlet,
you're going to want to
the
grab...
owlet. The owlet.
That sounds right.
The silver
Yeah.
owlet, but it was a particular
Silver owlet.
version.
That sounds right. Either way, you're going to want to grab a few silver outlets and save those for the prequel. Who knows when that's coming out. But when it does, I'm sure you're going to be hearing from us again. And I'm excited to check that out when it comes out. I'm excited to hear from any of you folks who've read The Blacktongue Thief. If you want to chat with us, we're excited to, you'll have the option to do that on social media. We'll give our accounts in a second. But yeah, Charles, it's been a lot of fun talking about this book. It was really easy, like hour, 20-minute discussion. I feel like I could talk so much more about it, but
I know there's
the
interesting
it's good
magic
to show
systems
some...
in place, the interesting political implications in place, but I'm sure there'll be more opportunities to talk about BTF or BTT, Blacktongue Thief. Oh, I guess
BTT.
Blacktongue is one word. I'm not sure.
BT.
The old BT.
I'm sure that doesn't stand for anything else important.
Nope, nothing at all. So we will certainly be talking more. And I mean, Christopher Buehlman has a bunch of other books in his library already. They're not fantasy, but they're fantasy. One of them seems fantasy adjacent, so who knows? You never know. But and until next time, folks, I think there's nothing left to do, Dylan, but play that sweet, sweet outro music.
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right. Thank you all so much for listening to yet another episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, if you want to support the show, or say hi to us, or let us know what you think about
no, only
Blacktongue
support us.
Thief, go on to social media, find us on Instagram at the FTF Podcast, and then the FTF Podcast number 1 at the end for Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard on the show and they already support us on social media and they want to do something a little bit more to give our show a nice little boost, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can now do on Spotify. That's where most of you are listening, and you just need to click twice to offer us 5 stars right there at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and that helps us so much when you do that. You can also offer us a rating and or review on Apple Podcasts. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
You're right, guys. Just listening already so much more than we could have ever hoped. Thank you all so much for listening. And as always, the rah buddy boy rah. Just kidding, guys. As always, go forth and conquer, friends.